So today I'm here with my fabulous colleague, Alexia, who I think is easily one of the funniest and smartest people I've ever met. So I'm really excited to dive into a topic today that is very near and dear to her heart and kind of just get some of her insight and experiences on these things, as I believe in the true importance of talking about these things. Although they're uncomfortable sometimes, I think they are so important to give people the space to actually express these things and sit through that discomfort. So, Alexia, thank you so much for being here. Do you want to just start off by quickly introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Alexia. I always really falter at questions of who am I? I think first and foremost, I'm a community helper. I really love to give back to my community in whatever ways kind of work and make sense. Try and give at least 100% of myself, oftentimes more. Really consider myself to be an auntie to youth in the community that I work with. And professionally, my background has been pretty diverse. Always kind of in the realm of working with young people towards well-being. I started out as an educator working in inclusive education spaces. And then through my undergrad, which was in Dev Psych, shout out to Carleton. And I minored in disability studies. So really early on, I was really obsessed with the idea of accessibility and true inclusive practices for everybody, regardless of need, and just meeting people where they're at. And so then I shifted into more of a community helper role and was working directly with youth, supporting well-being. I worked with a wide variety of Indigenous youth in the community here in Ottawa, from kids in care, kids dealing with the youth criminal justice system, kids just maybe having a little bit of a hard time, and kids having a great time. And really just tried to meet them where they were at and support them in whatever ways that they were needing. And now, as you said, we're colleagues at jack.org. I work as the Indigenous lead at a mental health charity focused on life promotion and mental health programming for youth. My job there is to take the really quality programming that we have and just make sure that it's a safe and responsive space for Indigenous youth that are taking part. And I'm finishing up my master's in counseling and still working in the Ottawa Indigenous community, working with women and children recovering from abuse and dealing with just the impacts of intergenerational trauma and different social determinants of health and well-being.
Wow, so well-rounded. You've done it all in such a short amount of time as well. But I mean, from my perspective, I feel like you're exactly in the space that you need to be right now, doing the community aspect with jack.org and then kind of doing your private practice, almost finishing that up soon on the side. I think that'll really just give you the best exposure to combine your knowledge and your passions together to make the greatest impact on those that you're working with. So good for you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. It's journey and a half. I've always kind of worked full time alongside school, so can't tell a lie. It's not always the most relaxing and peaceful, but we're getting it done. And it's, like you said, it's a great way to combine a theoretical and practical knowledge all at the same time. So it's great.
Breaks are important too, Alexia. Make sure you are giving yourself the space to breathe.
Oh, yikes. Yeah, that's a whole, I'm sure we'll dive more into that conversation, but absolutely. And that's a challenge, I think, for anybody who does work in this space, is just prioritizing ourselves the way we prioritize others.
Absolutely. Awesome. Okay. Well, it's so great to have you here. Can you start off today's conversation by just talking a little bit about your passion for raising awareness and ultimately improving Indigenous mental health?
Yeah. So I think along with any, man, that conversation is so big and I always kind of struggle of where to start. But I think I kind of alluded to it, by meeting people where they're at. And that's just such a big part of the conversation. And when you're working with Indigenous communities, it's so important to remember that we are living and existing in a system that is not designed for us. I also realized I didn't identify where I'm from in my opener. So I'm Mi'kmaq from Listigish First Nation, and I live in Ottawa on unceded Algonquin territory. And so my perspective is kind of like a mishmash of cultural expectations and traditions. So when I speak, like, that's my one perspective. So with that being said, and that keeping that in mind, my perspective on that is just we're living in systems that are not designed to see us succeed. In fact, like, quite the opposite. Like, we're living in a system as Indigenous folks that is designed to, like, eradicate us and see us erased. And like you said at the beginning, that's an uncomfortable fact for a lot of folks, and it is important to sit in that discomfort. But we have, like, legislature and acts and all of these things that actually, like, physically made it impossible for Indigenous people to thrive for a really long time. And indeed, like, even survive a lot. Like, we've really faced, like, a cultural genocide here in Canada. And I think that often goes skated over, which is very intentional by, like, Canadian systems of power. So I think when we then, like, narrow down into the conversation of Indigenous mental health, you just have to be aware of all of that. You have to be considering that all the time. Like, it's a foundational understanding that we're predispositioned to struggle because we're trying to live in this system that's designed to see us struggle. And so prioritizing Indigenous mental health means trying to abolish those systems, create new ones, and, like, hold peace in the middle while trying to do that, like, kind of balancing act. And we have so many families that are struggling with intergenerational trauma, and so many families that for a long time weren't safe in their identity. And now there's, like, a really powerful resurgence of Indigenous youth. And I would say, like, it's in, you know, I'm on the later spectrum of youth, but it's really been around this generation that there's been, like, a really powerful resurgence of, like, I'm very proud to be Native and to be Indigenous. And while that's really powerful on the one hand, we also have generations of older folks. And of course, like, I'm kind of oversimplifying. There's always people that don't fit into that. But there's so much trauma that's been passed down. And so there's a lot of fear around being proud of being Indigenous, I think, from older generations, because they've seen like, the actual physical harm that can happen. And now we're in a space where we're kind of like, we're not tolerating the physical harm anymore. And now it's time to focus on unpacking, like, the emotional and mental and spiritual harm that's been done. And so just working through that is, like, the foundational knowledge, and then meeting people where they're at to address, like, the specific needs that they have based on whatever, like, social determinants of mental health have impacted their well-being. And that looks very individualized per person. So it's a lot to be aware of. And if you're not aware of it, you run into the problem of, like, pan-indigenizing an approach, or approaching things with, like, a monolithic perspective. And it's so important to dismantle that as you're trying to do the work. So it's a really big juggling act, but we need to prioritize Indigenous mental health because it just looks different than non-Indigenous mental health, like, in a nice summation.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I love how you brought up the generational piece, because I feel like growing up in the Canadian school system, like, we were taught about residential schools, but it was always talked about as if it was this far back in history thing, when the last school closed in 1996, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
96. Okay. So it's still so recent. And that intergenerational piece is obviously going to linger from the parents who were there to the kids. It's just something that sticks with you and your family. And then more broadly, your culture. Like, it's, like you said, how you feel, or how you're scared to feel proud about something that has so much, like, been taken away by people in power and just people in society as well, that it's always been something looked down upon.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think it's so important to recognize like how recent this stuff still is and know that like it's going to impact people, not just in this generation, but for generations to come as well. And there's still so much work that we need to do. So you mentioned as well that like kind of systemic approach when moving away from a pan-Indigenous approach. And I know you're working in the mental health space as well. So what would moving away from an approach like that in the mental health space specifically ideally look like?
Yeah. So I think again, like these questions are so layered, right? Like there's like different steps that you have to take. But instead of getting to take them like one step at a time, you're kind of trying to take all the steps at the same time. It's like a circle of stairs. And so like on the systemic level, you know, obviously there's like the biggest like governmental systems, like legislature, acts of violence, even, and that impacts like language, like, and like the discourse around language is, I think, not often spoken about enough. But I had a question yesterday. I was delivering a workshop on the impacts of intergenerational trauma, and I interchange my language a lot. Like I'll say I'm Native versus like I'm Indigenous or I'm Mi'kmaq or I'm First Nations. And of course, not all of that language is for everybody to use. Like I don't want a non-Indigenous person referring to me as Native. But I had the question of like, why can't we say Native? And like, that's such a hard question to answer succinctly, because in order to do that, you have to unpack like this like generational piece, of course. And I was just like, you know, it's kind of like a word association game. Like it's associated so strongly with harm that it's like not everyone's word to use. And so that is like the daily, the day-to-day impact of the problematic system. And so, yeah, I'm kind of diverting a little bit, but it's hard to picture fixing systems and structures that are in place without thinking of that like day-to-day impact. So like as a bunch of young Indigenous youth are reclaiming that word Native, there is like this conversation and discourse of like, okay, well, if you're saying it, why can't I say it? And it's like, well, you can't say it because like there's still this system like up here that exists of oppression and like power dynamics. So again, it's like that circle of stairs that we're trying to take all at the same time. So there's like, yeah, greater governmental systems that need to be abolished, just entirely, to be honest. Because again, like they were designed to eradicate, and I'm a bit of a rebel, I guess, when it comes to that kind of talk, a bit of an anarchist, if you will. But I truly do believe that that's what like advocacy and allyship looks like when we're working with Indigenous communities. And like that extends again to like other racialized and Black communities too, like that have been perpetually harmed. But I'm speaking from my own perspective. And so I think on a structural level, like we also see, you know, education systems and healthcare systems. And so on that level of systemic racism, we see like the actual school system in and of itself, like while we've removed like the abuse and like the forced kind of religion and the monolith approach there, the actual foundation of education really hasn't changed since the days of residential schools. And so we're still expecting Indigenous children and youth to succeed in a system that once was designed as a genocidal tactic. And I say that as someone who worked in the education system and as someone who has a lot of respect for the education system. But it's very much a linear approach, right? Like we start kids in JK and SK and we have expectations and they have to meet those expectations to move into grade 1. And then we have elementary school where they have these different expectations that they're expected to meet. And so for anybody who doesn't fit into that standard, that like normative curve, and I don't really like to talk in statistics, but really when we're talking about inclusive spaces, we're talking about spaces that exist for the standard. So anybody who doesn't fit into that is going to struggle. And so like that's one piece of like the systemic discrimination that Indigenous kids face. And then when we look at that from like a medical approach, we can talk about genetics, we can talk about epigenetics and the way in which whatever you're inherently born with will either be a passive gene or an assertive gene based on like the environment that you're growing up in. So for Indigenous kids who have this intergenerational trauma that's deeply ingrained within them, the school system can be a really just inherently violent place to exist. And sometimes there's not always like those markers where we can say, hey, that's the problem. I can say anecdotally, I was one of those kids. Like I was a great student. I was like succeeding, you know, by all of those standards that I talked about before of like meeting expectations. But I was like chronically anxious within that school system, starting at a really young age. Like I was in grade 1, and like I was scared and crying to go to school in the morning because I was like, I don't like my teacher. And then like transitioning that into grade 4, like, you know, 8 or 9 years old, I was having a hard time sleeping at night because I would look at my alarm clock and be like, it's X amount of hours until I'm back at school in the morning. And then because that went unnoticed and uncared for by systems that didn't know how to care for, it translated into me being like a really combative teenager in high school. Like I was that teenager cussing out my teachers, skipping school, getting into fights, and doing really well academically because like that was like the societal expectation still. But if you asked my teachers, you know, 10 years later, they'd probably be like, good Lord, like that kid gave me gray hairs earlier in life than I should have had. So like that, again, like those are like the day-to-day impacts of like these systems that are designed to see us kind of fail. Medically too, like I said, the healthcare system, it's a really interesting juxtaposition because a lot of the time, like Indigenous folks have to push and advocate so hard for themselves to receive adequate treatment. But we're also one of the first groups that's very quick to have a diagnosis stamped on us that can impact our lives. So it's like we're diagnosed with the wrong thing and not given the right supports while trying to advocate for the right things and really going nowhere with it. And so especially when we talk about colonial violence, you know, I always remind folks like it's really not historical. Like this is ongoing. You know, we had Jordan Anderson, who died in care because the provincial and federal governments couldn't agree on who was to care for this First Nations child. Maybe just like very briefly for folks who don't know about Jordan Anderson, he was a child born with like a bunch of complex medical issues. And because of systemic violence, and he had his Indian status card, which again, power of language and discourse around racism there. Still using terms like Indian status card is inherently really harmful. But Jordan was born with complex health needs, and the province of Manitoba said, well, he's a registered status Indian, therefore he's a federal problem. And the federal government said, no, healthcare is a provincial issue. He's your problem. And they went back and forth. And Jordan died in the hospital without receiving any of the care that he needed for his complex medical challenges. And so like that's a child who was killed by one system before even getting to the second problematic system. I'm going to stop there and maybe ask for like a follow-up question as we talk about these systems. 'Cause like, wow, I'm spiraling.
All good. I think it's important to just hear your perspective. So thank you. And I think that example, although very, very sad, is a good example of the picture that this whole thing paints and why Indigenous folks are more susceptible to things like this, because it's such like an ongoing, deeply rooted systemic issue that we still don't not have an answer for, but like we don't have the correct systems in place to really take care of these people. And unfortunately, things like Jordan's situation really highlights that. So I guess a follow-up question to what you're going on about would be like, on a systemic level, this is very broad again, I'm sorry, but like if you could pick 2 or 3 things that you would want to change today and see implemented in our society today, what would they be?
Yeah. I think that, yeah, that's obviously such a hard question, because to try and picture a world without colonial violence is um, unheard of. On like a global scale, there's colonial violence everywhere for Indigenous folks, not just for Canadian Indigenous folks. But I think we have change makers. We have like this incredible group of generations that are really doing the work. And so I think it needs to be led by us. Like I love the quote, like nothing about us without us. And so I think having Indigenous voices at like the forefront of everything that we're doing is like the most key thing. And then in doing that, like, you know, we need funding for services. We need funding for whatever Indigenous folks are saying we need funding for, to be quite honest. Because again, we approach the idea of like social services with a very colonial approach. Like, it's very westernized. So instead of like superimposing, you know, you need a psychologist, you need a psychotherapist. And again, I say that as someone who's doing my master's in counseling, but actually asking communities what they need to see themselves succeed. And then doing that. We've had a lot of years of just like kind of talk and mouth service and lip service from systems. And it's kind of time to deliver. Like, and I think there's a really powerful group of youth that are demanding that deliverance, which is incredible to see and be a part of. So there's that. Like, first and foremost, listen to Indigenous voices and like do the thing that we're telling you. And then I think, again, like on that systemic and structural level, and again, this takes so much reworking, and I'm really kind of dreaming big here and picturing like a world without colonial violence, but abolishing these systems of oppression and like starting fresh and like working in with an inclusive approach from the get-go to make sure that everyone's needs are met. Like, it's wild when we talk about like societal supports, but the societal supports are not meeting everybody. And so that's really where I try and focus a lot of my energy, like as a community helper and in the projects that I do. And like definitely happy to talk more about the different kind of things that I've done. But then there's like the burnout problem of people trying to do this work and constantly trying to advocate for ourselves. That gets really exhausting. And so that, like, you know, circles back to my first point of like, listen to us when we say what we need and just try and support that. I recently spoke on a panel on the topic was allyship to advocacy. And I get a lot of non-Indigenous folks and non-racialized folks and non-Black folks saying like, you know, what can I do to help? How can I help? And I'm like, take the listening that you're doing, because allies are great at listening. Like, a true ally is a great listener. And to take that to the next level of actual advocacy is being brave enough, like you said, to sit in that discomfort, unlearn as needed, and like lend your voice to people who are doing the work and who like historically and ongoing have violence perpetuated against them for doing that work and for being that voice. So that's not, I guess, like a perfect answer, but I think like systems, like we would see a true impact and a true change in systems if that was followed, like if that was just done on like a structural and everyday kind of level.
No, you did great. It was a very tough question, so I apologize. But I think sometimes it's interesting to hear like what direction people go when you give them a broad question like that, which is what I normally do on this show. So thank you for tolerating that. But no, I really like what you said about like just giving a voice to the people who have direct lived experience and the ones who are advocating for the needs of Indigenous folks specifically, because I think it's so important to take that cultural approach. Like, you can't treat everybody equally. You need that cultural lens. and how you were talking about like the societal approaches, like we're so quick to be like, go see a therapist, go see a psychologist. But we're ignoring things like elders, community helpers, natural healing, things that would like really benefit Indigenous folks because it has such a strong cultural aspect to it. And I see you nodding. So if you have anything to add, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a great point. And like so maybe to provide, like to add another complex layer of nuance to this conversation, I'm doing my master's in counseling. And I'm doing my master's in counseling. So it's, you know, on the one hand, I'm saying like, don't just recommend a counselor, don't just recommend a therapist. Meanwhile, like by designation and professional trade, I am a registered psychotherapist qualifying. But a big part of the reason that I'm doing that is because, again, systemically, my voice is often not heard or it's often put down. And so colonial letters from a colonial institution like an education and a university behind my name provide strength to me, and they provide strength to my voice. And I always kind of, I actually, part of the reason I said I struggle with how I introduce myself is because I always introduce myself in a very different way depending on who I'm talking to. So today, talking on a mental health podcast, I'm so happy to lead first with like my lived experience and like, hey, here's what I've done. But that conversation looks a lot different when I'm meeting different people. So when I'm speaking with, you know, management in workplaces or executive leadership teams, instead of saying, hey, I'm an auntie, I'm an educator, I'm a community helper, I'm like, hey, I'm a master's of counseling candidate. And hey, I have my registered psychotherapist qualifying designation. Hey, I finished top of my class at Carleton. To me, those things are really inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. I'm very lucky. I'm very privileged to have gone to university. I think privilege is a whole other conversation. And I always challenge the conversation. I don't believe privilege is a static thing. I think it's very dynamic and fluid. And in some situations, you can be very privileged. And in some situations, you can be very oppressed. And so I was very privileged to get to go to university. But what I want to do with my university is just say, like, now those voices who have an excuse to exclude me and to ignore my voice, on paper, you have to listen. But so going back to like community methodologies of healing, I think it's so important. There's a big generation of us that are doing all of these colonial things and getting these letters behind our name to give strength to Indigenous voices. And I think hopefully in the future, what that means is that we're not discounted from the get-go. One of my favorite teachings that resonates with me as I continue to do the work and I struggle, like there are really, really bad days in doing this work, right? Like I see a lot of trauma, I witness a lot of trauma, and I'm someone who is on my own healing journey from intergenerational trauma. So one of the teachings that I really return to a lot and I really ground myself in is the 7 generations teaching. And the 7 generations teaching reminds us that everything we do as an individual today, we're going to see the impact of over the next 7 generations. So the idea is to do it in a good way. People around me hear me say that a whole awful lot. Like, I'm doing this in a good way. I'm trying to approach this in a good way. Because I know that the things that I'm doing are going to impact those generations that come 7 after me. And so for my position in society is that I have 7 generations behind me who were really colonially harmed. And there was a lot of violence perpetuated against them. And so we are a generation, and the following generations are this like change-making generation where we're working on intergenerational healing on an individual level and working on that like systemic advocacy and change on a different level, so that the 7 generations that are going to come after us won't have to carry this burden anymore. Like, we really want to change the narrative from a reactive one to like dealing with intergenerational trauma to like promoting intergenerational healing. And so that is what I mean when I say like, yeah, going to elders and making sure that those elders have support to like hold the burden of community pain and community suffering, so that we can do that healing, and going to see healers and being able to reconnect with your culture and reconnect with the land. Like there's also teachings around Mother Earth, and like she's our first mother and she gives us everything that we need. And so giving Indigenous youth and not just youth, like everybody, giving Indigenous folks the ability and like the power to be out on the land and to do that healing in a way that makes sense to them. We need to set up new structures that allow for that and that encourage that. So that's why I get really excited when people are like returning to those traditional and cultural ways, because oftentimes I'm leading conversations from a colonial way to ensure that my voice is heard in a good way. But really, like, the root of the conversation is like, yeah, traditional practices and healing and culture is the way to go.
I love that. And it leads me into our next question, but you're talking about like the individual healing. And I think talking about like the colonial things is like one big conversation, but then going back to the individual and how these folks specifically are impacted by all these things. So you talk a lot about like Indigenous folks having sovereignty over wellness practices. And I think that's related to like that individual piece and how they're reconnecting back to their roots. So can you explain what that means for anybody who doesn't know and maybe give an example of what this would look like?
Yeah, which is such a great segue into the work that I get to do at Jack. So sovereignty over wellness is such a basic concept, but such a hard concept for folks to wrap their minds around. Sovereignty over wellness just means empowering a voice to advocate for their needs on an individual level, and then giving them the tools that they're asking for and that they're advocating for. So yeah, sovereignty over wellness just means like empowering those voices. And that means, you know, we have so many big cultural differences across Canada when we look at different groups. But then on the other side of that, there's a lot of similarities, and a lot of times we get stuck on the similarities and we try and approach with like I've been talking about, this monolithic kind of like every Indigenous person needs this, and that's like such a harmful rhetoric to continue. And so sovereignty over wellness really means getting to talk on an individual level and be like, hey, you know, Alexia, what do you need from your lived experience? Like I said, I'm a Mi'kmaq living on Algonquin territory, so my teachings are like a mishmash of Algonquin and Mi'kmaq teachings, and that's really beautiful for me, and that's something that really resonates for me. But so what that would mean is that I wouldn't necessarily fit into like a Mi'kmaq way of healing per se, or an Algonquin way of healing. Like I would need my own path and my own future. And so giving everybody the right to that is so big. And so, you know, we have hundreds of communities across Canada that have their own practices, their own traditions. And a side note, what I really love about Indigenous cultures is that so much of those things we are willing to share with non-Indigenous folks, but there certainly are closed practices as well. And it's being able to emphasize the difference between those and give strength and power to those practices, both open and closed, in those different communities that support well-being. So a project that I'm really excited about that I'm launching with jack.org, that's been like my baby for the last year. Like I'm so excited. I'm going to try not to get emotional about it, because I just got like a bunch of pieces from our content and comms team that are like done, dusted, ready to go. A project that we're working on is storytelling from Indigenous perspectives. And so at jack.org, we have the Jack Talk, which is like a peer-to-peer mental health conversation. And it encompasses like lived experience with mental health moments and journeys, education pieces, and it comes from youth to youth. And I think that that's like such a beautiful way to learn. And I took that and I just said, we need to indigenize this, and we need to make it really resonate with Indigenous kids. And how can we do that? Well, we need to listen to Indigenous kids. So we've started the project. It's been a year. We have, after our national summit in a month, we'll have close to 30 stories of Indigenous youth from all across Turtle Island sharing their experiences with mental health. And so I ask them like a progression of questions, and I just start really basically with like, what does mental health mean to you? What is good mental health? What is bad mental health? We have that kind of conversation. And then I say, okay, next kind of big question, what has your mental health journey looked like? We have that conversation. There's like follow-ups based on whatever the kids talk about. So far, we've covered topics like intergenerational trauma. We've talked about substance use. We've talked about like the education system not being designed for us. We've talked about climate crisis as ways of impacting mental health. So we have these big conversations, and then I say, how does your community or culture support that? And that's that moment where it becomes a really sovereign moment of like, this is my Indigenous culture. This is the group that I belong to, the community that I belong to, and this is how I'm supported through that. And then the last question is like a call to action. And it's like, what do you need and what do you see a need for in your community to continue promoting well-being? And so that's sovereignty over wellness, is that we're listening to voices from individual communities, telling us what they need in like very clear terms. Like there's no confusion around it. It's not a gray area. It's like, this is what they're asking for. And so I'm so excited. It's the videos are beautifully done. They're masterfully edited. And they're so deeply personal. Like you can just see the light in these Indigenous youth shining when they are asked to advocate for themselves and when they're given that platform. And so I'm really excited to promote that across Canada. And like, when I say that, I believe in it so fully and so strongly that this is going to be life-saving work. When we talk about Indigenous mental health, there's some like really harsh realities, like, a general Canada-wide suicide rate of 5 to 6 times higher than non-Indigenous voices. When we look at Inuit communities, that can go up to like 11 to 12% higher. And like, meanwhile, we only make up about 10% of the youth population across Canada. So those numbers, like the overrepresentation of suicide is heartbreaking. Like there's no other way to say it. It's heartbreaking, and it's so wrong that we're losing so many voices. And so this project that we're going to launch, it's so close and it's so near and dear to my heart. And I truly believe that it's going to be life-saving stuff. And I think about, the 15-year-old version of Alexia who was like cursing out her teachers and like skipping school, because I didn't see a space for myself to practice that wellness. And I, on a very personal level, would have been saved a lot of years of like self-stigmatization, if I had had access to a program like this. And we're just taking that individualized level in so many incredible directions. With Jack.org and the Indigenous portfolio, we focused a lot on harm reduction up in the north at our Northern Summit. We had a panel of like incredible Northern Indigenous youth speaking about their experiences with substance use and with harm reduction and the reasons that they had to venture down that path and the reasons that they got involved in substances in the first place, and just their stories of like what recovery looked like on that individual level was so beautiful. We had so many emotional youth saying like, I've lost friends to substance use. And if we had more programming like this and more opportunities to hear these types of stories, I know that I wouldn't have lost some of these friends. We got these youth trained in naloxone deliveries. So they are some of like, in a lot of the cases, there's one person in a community who can deliver naloxone life-saving treatment, and it's a youth that came to our summit and learned about harm reduction and spoke with Indigenous advocates, and that's huge. And being able to do that, like targeted, individualized, but community-based healing is one of my biggest career successes to date. To see that impact is, I don't think words can describe the feeling adequately.
No, and I mean, I honestly had goosebumps while you were talking about that whole thing because you can feel your passion through it. And just hearing like the things that you're doing and have continued to do at jack.org is so incredibly inspiring. And I think, I mean, you're taking the existing programming that we know has already had such a big impact. It's that youth to youth approach that people really, really enjoy. It's the power of storytelling that audiences really gravitate to. So when you take like a cultural lens and bring Indigenous voices into this to show specifically to Indigenous folks who might be struggling with similar things, the impact that that is going to have, like, I'm so excited for it. From a work perspective, like, I'm just so excited to be able to offer this to people that I've had conversations with who are looking for something like this, but it wasn't quite ready yet. So when this is ready to go off the ground to share, I am just so excited to see how people react to it, because I truly believe in like the power that this is going to have. And just when we tell stories, when we share like the really, really hard stuff and open up about these deep mental health conversations, I think we connect so much better with others, and it just contributes to that change on like such a larger level.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to see it launched. We're almost there. We've got like a promo trailer now. It's so beautiful. There are stills, there's music, there's quotes from all of the youth. There's one incredible quote that's resounded with everyone who's watched it so far. And she just talks really beautifully about like ending stigma is suicide prevention. And I think that is such an incredible summation of just like the power of talking about mental health in like that open way, like you just said, like having open dialogues, not being afraid to dive into tricky conversations. Like that's life-changing, life-saving work. And I'm so excited for youth to get to dive into this and to be supported through it. They're going to be supported the whole way. I want to just say that as well. Like there's mental health supports that are going to be available. And again, we've decolonized that approach too. And it's not just counselors. It's not just therapists. It's up to our teachers and our youth workers who are organizing these Indigenous Jack Talks to bring in whoever is going to resonate best with the youth that we're working with. My team is going in to host like sharing circles to facilitate like more knowledge and open conversation around like the learning that's shared through the video watching. So it's a very supported system. One of the workshops that I do a lot actually for like educators working with young people, I call it like circles of care. And it's really because when we're working with an individual, the idea is that we provide wraparound care and that, you know, kids can't be harmed if they're in like a bubble wrap encasing of like love and community support and uplifting. And so we've provided that in these Indigenous Jack Talk offerings. And I'm so excited to see it launched so soon. Spring 2023. Can't wait.
That's honestly incredible. And like, I hope you're patting yourself on the back, and not even everybody that this is going to be shown to, but those 30 Indigenous folks that you chose or they volunteered to come on and share their stories, like the impact that will have for those individuals specifically who were comfortably given a space to open up and talk about these really hard things. I can only imagine how that will impact them moving forward, just to strengthen their voice and be more comfortable talking about these really tough things.
Yeah, I had one youth email me back. So one of the things that we built into the contract, again, with sovereignty over wellness, is I really wanted to prioritize like this story belongs to you. Like it's your story and it's yours the whole time. And so one of the things that we built into the contract, because the youth were paid for this as well, which I think is really big, paying people for their knowledge and their labor is like, cannot stress the importance of that enough. So number one, we paid them, and that's why there was like a contract involved. But part of the contract was we're only going to use your story for a year for this amount of money. And then we're going to ask you, hey, do you still want your story to be used in this way? And if not, like, here it is. Like, it's back to you. It's yours. But another thing that we said is that, like, they got the final say on, like, the edits and everything. So when I got those final copies from the content and communications team at jack.org and I sent them out to the youth, I had one youth who, when we were speaking in person, they had so much doubt in their voice, and they were like, what if I'm not the right person to be doing this? And I was like, there is no wrong person to be doing this. Like, every story and every voice lends to a community of care, and to that circle of care wraparound piece that I was just talking about. And your voice has a place in that. Again, another teaching that we have is that everything is done in a circle, because it means that everyone has a space, and a circle can always become bigger to bring in more people. And I love that. And I love that it's rooted in one of our teachings of humility. And the humility teaching tells us that, like, no one is above or below anybody else. And that's not just for people, it's for creatures, it's for bugs, it's for birds, it's for fish, it's for crawlers, it's for everybody. And so part of this project has really been about empowering these youth to believe in their voices. And so when I sent this youth the copy of their video, they responded and they said, I had no idea the power that my voice could have. And I was just like, I'm so excited for you to be able to show your community this video. And they're going to be so proud of you. And, like, that is intergenerational healing happening. So yeah, empowering these voices. I'm so excited. I'm so touched. I'm so honored to be a facilitator and a helper in the space.
Butterflies. I love that, and just seeing the impact that you've already had. And I'm so excited for what's going to come from this. Like, truthfully, everything you've done is so inspiring. And I'm just so excited to get this kicked off the ground. So fingers crossed, things are done soon. And then kind of wrapping it back to, you mentioned at the beginning, the importance of just giving Indigenous folks the space to talk and listen to them. But I'm wondering what else we as non-Indigenous folks can do to better support the needs and rights of Indigenous peoples more at an individual level, if there's anything that comes to mind.
Yeah. So like I said, there's a lot of practices that we have are closed, but there's just as many, if not more, that are open. And so, again, like, there's so many systemic barriers that are going to take years and years to dismantle. But in the meantime, like, there's things like just supporting Indigenous voices when you can, and supporting Indigenous businesses. If I can give a plug to like a supporter, like, this is what advocacy looks like true advocacy in my mind. There's an Instagram page. It's called Women Helping Women Beadwork. And it's a woman in Winnipeg who supports incarcerated Indigenous women across Manitoba by selling, like, the beaded earrings that they make while incarcerated. And depending on, like, the system, like, depending on the jail that they're in, and if it's, like, higher security or whatnot, she'll either, like, put the money, like, directly to them and give it to them, or she puts it into savings accounts so that upon their release, like, they have something to just kickstart their life. Because we know that there's also this overrepresentation of Indigenous folks in prisons, and it's a lot of the time racially based. And I say that, and I'm, like, not just being an anarchist. I'm saying that because I've worked with youth in the criminal justice system and I've seen it firsthand. But so, like, that is something that, like, directly supports an Indigenous person in having a better life and in living in that good way. And really embodies a lot of our teachings. And she's not an Indigenous person. She's just an advocate. She's just someone who cares for the community. So, like, follow through. Like, when you say you're an ally and you want to be doing the thing and you want to be turning yourself into an advocate, demonstrate that. I don't believe in ethical consumerism under a capitalistic world, which again, I'm an anarchist. We've talked about it. But so money makes the world go round. And so we have advocates, Indigenous advocates on the land, who are getting arrested and who have like lawyer fees and who like all of that, like, empty your pockets. If you have the privilege and you have the power to be donating to legal fees, like do that. That's a great way to support Indigenous folks. Showing up to things like our open powwows and purchasing from vendors and supporting dancers and hearing the stories and hearing the traditions. By uplifting Indigenous culture and appreciating it, that's a great way to support Indigenous folks. Something like these Indigenous Jack Talks, I have like a vision of one day where they're used for something like a cultural safety training or like a cultural humility training. There are a lot of options out there. Universities do them a lot of times for free. There's different systems that are like you can pay to do them, like Indigenous cultural safety trainings. Those are a great way to just, in order to be a good advocate, you got to know the history and you got to know the ongoing violence. So like educate yourself it's just a huge one. And then be a person who cares. Like I feel like it's really not that hard. Be a person who cares. There are so many, like there are Indigenous cultural centers in like every urban center and in a lot of rural centers too. And they'll do community programming and like go to that and like meet the Indigenous people that live in your communities, and chat with them and just treat them like a normal person. That one feels obvious, but for anyone out there who's struggling with that, we're people. We're cool. Show up if you have the power, and I say this knowing that it's not an option for everybody. But when there are opportunities to show up and show your support at marches or walks or protests, do that. Like, there are certain people who will be like brutalized by police for being in those situations, and there are certain people who won't be brutalized by police. So go and like use the power and privilege that you have, if you have that privilege and power to not be oppressed by violent police states, to protect the advocates that are doing the work. Yeah, I don't know. Is that enough calls to action? Listen to us.
That was plenty. And I'm going to put a list of resources in the episode notes as well. So maybe we can chat offline. I'm going to add some organizations, community groups, books, documentaries. Like those are my favorite ways to learn, just hearing people's stories. I just love storytelling and learning from lived experience. So I'll put some of my favorite books in there. What else? Organizations you can donate to. We'll have a whole list for you if anybody's interested in following up. But no, this has been honestly, truthfully amazing. And then my last question, I kind of want to leave on a positive note for any young Indigenous folks who may be listening to this today. If you could give any words of comfort to anyone who is struggling with any of these things that we discussed, mental health related, what would it be?
Yeah. It's a big question. Number one, just know that you're not alone in it. Like I've talked about, there is a lot that works against us, but there's, also so much love and care and community. So reminding youth and not just youth, reminding any Indigenous person that you don't have to suffer alone. So much of our culture is rooted in community care and loving a person for who they are. A really interesting thing is that like pre-contact and pre-colonial languages like English, French, etc., Indigenous languages didn't operate in like a deficit-based way. So we actually didn't even have words for things like mental unwellness or lack of well-being or disorders. we've always really viewed individual as like a holistic entity, and like belief that you are exactly the way creator made you. And like that is such a beautiful thing. And I think it's so important to try and get back to that way of thinking and way of seeing people, because my God, when you see someone for everything that they are versus the things that they're not, suddenly you have so much more of a deep appreciation and understanding of who they are. And it's colonial systems that teach us to look at that deficits-based approach. And so just don't suffer alone. Like there are resources, there are people who want to see us succeed. One of my favorite reminders, another great Indigenous creator, Native Love Notes, has a bunch of stickers and things that say like, we are everything our ancestors dreamed of. And I believe that so fully and so strongly. And what the ancestors didn't want was for us to be suffering in silence. They wanted us to be out living authentically and taking everything that is meant for us and everything that we've been denied. And that starts with learning to advocate for yourself. And for someone who's just starting in that journey, advocating for yourself can and literally should look like, I need help. Being able to verbalize that, just saying I need help and asking for it and accepting it, is the biggest gift that we can give to ourselves. And as I'm talking about that 7 generations teaching, 7 generations won't have better outlooks on life if we don't start somewhere. And so the biggest and hardest step is saying I need help. And the biggest and hardest step is saying I'm struggling and I need help. But there's really no shame in that. And there's so many opportunities for love and care on a community level and to be built into a systemic level that it starts with that vulnerability. Another teaching we have is bravery. It's one of the 7 sacred teachings, one of the 7 grandfather teachings. And a lot of the time bravery is like misplaced for like combative bravery, and we think of like superheroes and knights in shining armor. But I really think that the biggest form of bravery is being vulnerable and being brave enough to say that you're struggling is the biggest help that you can give yourself. It's the most self-love that you can possibly show, is just saying I need help.
I think that's such a beautiful way to kind of come together with everything that we discussed. And honestly, we could talk for hours. There's so many different like directions we can take this conversation, and maybe we can have you back soon to discuss some of those other things. But honestly, today, I think this is such a great start for this conversation for anybody who might not be familiar with some of these intergenerational pieces, Indigenous mental health. We also talked about some of the suicide rates of Indigenous folks. And I think just naming these things, putting them out there and showing that this is an ongoing issue. It's not a thing of the past. It's something that is recent history, but also still going on today and well for generations to come. And I think a lot of what you shared will highlight that and hopefully make more people aware of what the current situation looks like and some calls to action for where we need to go, things we can do on both an individual and a systemic level. So yeah, I am honestly just blown away. I'm so grateful that you were willing to come on and share these things with us, and just everything you're doing for the community is mind-blowing. Like, it's so inspirational, and I'm so excited to see the impact that you'll have on both Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks, truly.
Oh, thank you so much, Angelica. It was lovely. I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, these conversations are not always easy, and they can, bring up a lot of discomfort, but there's also a lot of beauty in having them and just being authentic. So always happy to have these conversations, and really grateful to you for sharing the space and the platform to do so today.
Thank you so much, and keep doing everything you're doing.
Well, Lolin, thank you.